Today I'll be talking about the safety of navigation following Mr. Bull's presentation regarding ECDIS, and we're going to be talking about 3 scenarios where the ECDIS was involved in some way in the result of the vessel's grounding, the risks also of a paperless chart system on board. So there are many benefits of having ECDIS on board, but there are also risks involved with complacency and over-reliance that we can't ignore. You can see here. In true American club fashion, we have to add a comic. So the mandatory carriage of ECDIS systems for ships on international voyages is still in the implementation phase until July of 2018, as we know. I think it's important that we identify the risks that are associated with the ECDIS systems and over-reliance on it before our full implementation. So as we see them, point them out. Oh, there we go. So the first incident is concerning took place in the Varne Bank. A chemical tanker carrying a cargo of vegetable oil ran aground in the Varne sandbank in the Dover Straits for approximately 3 hours. So on this incident, the passage plan was prepared using an ECDIS feature, ECDIS passage planning feature. There was a third mate who had prepared it. He had just been promoted to a second mate, to the navigational officer, and he drew the course line directly over the Varne Bank. The master unfortunately failed to identify this error in the passage plan, and the vessel had ran aground. In preparing the passage plan, perhaps one of the reasons why the third mate made this significant error is because in the feature, he used what we call a too small of a scale chart to lay his course line, which shows too grand of an area. Unfortunately, it did not show when he did it in that fashion, it didn't show the correct depth markers for that. So he was unable to detect that in passage planning. Also, the automatic hazard detection function, which are a feature of most ECDISs, was also indicated that there was a risk of grounding, but he was unable to determine, he was unable to really identify these hazard warnings in his own system. So an unfamiliarity with his own system. This incident number 2 deals with the authorized charts versus unauthorized charts. So in this situation, a vessel had a passage plan prepared on paper charts initially first. And what happened was the waypoints for the voyage plan that was prepared on paper charts was then transferred to the ECDIS. It was later found out that the system that was being used on board, the ECDIS system, did not have official charts on board. They were actually unofficial charts, which then changes the system, no longer an ECDIS, an electronic chart information display system, to just an electronic chart system. And this is only permitted to be used as an aid to navigation rather than a primary means of navigation, which an ECDIS is permitted to be used for. So just a few items about the official navigational charts. They must be produced by an official authority or institution or hydrographic office. They are used in the ECDIS standard training courses, so any IMO training course or compliant IMO training course will be, must have official charts. And also the frequency of updates to these charts is much less. Official charts will be updated on a weekly basis, just as traditional paper charts are in Notice to Mariners, where unofficial charts, the frequency of updates is a little bit is a little bit unknown, less regulated. So incident 3 is avoiding collision. In this situation, a third officer, again, had altered his course to starboard on several occasions. So he encountered a motor vessel on his port side, and he altered course to starboard for the motor vessel, and then encountered a sailing vessel, and again altered his course to starboard, but a little too prematurely, and he drifted into shallow waters. How ECDIS was involved here was there was a grounding safety function on the ECDIS, which did not sound. Unfortunately, it did activate on the ECDIS, but it did not have an audible alarm attached to it, or maybe if the audible alarm had sounded, it would have alerted the navigational officer to look at the electronic chart display. So in this situation, it didn't, and it was a factor in the overall outcome of this incident. So some common themes with these 3 incidents is the ECDIS was the primary means of navigation for these vessels. Typically, vessels will either have to have an ECDIS as their primary means with another backup ECDIS, or use a paper chart system as a backup. Also, the ship's officers had completed the generic ECDIS training. So where you had these unfamiliarities with their own ECDIS systems on board, they all had the required training. The training is actually, so right now I believe there's over 33 different types of ECDIS models out in the market, maybe more. But generic training is actually not required until, specific training isn't required until January 1st in accordance with the Manila Convention. So the required IMO general course was something that all of these officers had taken. And then the mistakes by the navigating officers, which went undetected by the master. Of course, there's still a need, even with all these electronic systems and checks, to have just an overseeing by the master, and adequate supervision by the master. So our ECDIS capabilities and limitations. So ECDIS features and alarms, I mean, these are great. You can set different parameters for safe depths. You can set audible alarms, and different warnings. And they are intended to help, the navigators. But what we should be looking out for is alarm deafness of our navigators. So that's being used to hearing alarms so often and acknowledging them that they become deaf to them, and it becomes not so much of an alert anymore. Also, the accuracy of the chart products that we're using on our ECDIS. Using the official, okay, I'm going to go 2 ways with this. We did talk about official versus unofficial chart products, but also just the quality of the hydrographic office. I mean, they do their best, but we don't always know, we don't always have the best information from every area. There are a lot of unsurveyed or partially surveyed, poorly surveyed areas. And it's just important. So one thing that we can do to mitigate that is making sure we check our category zones of confidence, and also reading the alerts on the charts, making sure that we understand what the quality of the chart is, whether it's electronic or paper. And again, the training and competency of the crew. So that's, we're going to have to move toward, of course, the IMO Model Course 1.27 is the operational use of electronic chart display information systems. This is a great training, but with the over 33 different models of ECDIS, it is going to be important to have these type-specific trainings, and the sooner the better. If it should wait to the implementation in 2017 is, I think, too late. So some foreseeable trends and risks: over-reliance. The importance of keeping a proper lookout should not be overlooked. Radar plottings, sites, compass errors, these are all things, as Mr. Bull pointed out, will come in handy in the event of an ECDIS failure. Improper settings, putting improper parameters or silencing alarms is something that we should also be aware of. And there should be procedures in place in the SMS to make sure that these items are being addressed. Also alarm deafness, which we spoke about, and different manufacturers of equipment. And of course, the anomalies. So a good example was in the first scenario, where the chart scale was increased so largely that the depth parameters could not be seen. You couldn't see the depth markings. So some ECDISs will have these little funky quirks to them that we should be aware of, and that'll only come with experience with your system and experience with the type of ECDIS that you're using on board. So an emphasis on practical navigation should always be kept in mind. And that's a good example, I thought, was a recent article. The U.S. Naval Academy reinstates celestial navigation. So it's just a matter of, I know that their concerns are a little different, GPS jamming and so forth, but this could also affect us, and the over-reliance on the electronic navigation is something that we should all just be aware of.